Cadet was clutching an electrical lead in Ichalula when the distinct scraping of the cave's wooden door broke her focus. The heavy bootfalls that followed told her that Andrew had returned to the cave. A gust of frigid wind blew inside, bringing with it a swirling puff of snow. A shiver ran up Catet's back, her feathers fluffing automatically. She froze, her wings holding the leads an inch above the circuit as she twisted her head around. There was a discreet shift of feathers on her neck, the sharp blue of her frill peeking through. The two main crown feathers on her head twitched as she eyed up the human. Andrew glanced over at her just as he was about to slide the irregularly shaped door back into place. At least he looked slightly apologetic. The human had been going in and out of the cave for the past 2 days. In and out, in and out. It was driving her crazy. She understood that soon the weather would prevent them from getting the resources they needed. But the constant frigid wind that always seemed to whip through the cave, and thus over her feathers, was getting annoying quickly. She had been trying her best to keep her frustration internal, but there was only so much she could take. The door closing sealed the cave off once more from the awful weather outside. Cadet gave a little sigh, trying to relax her puffed-up feathers from their involuntary position. Andrew walked over to the smoldering fire in the middle of the room, his head and shoulders covered in white snow. He made a few pokes at the fire with a stick, shifting around the coals before rising and walking to the back of the cave to retrieve another couple of logs. After adding them to the fire, Andrew dropped heavily onto the log stool and swiped his hand through the air a few times in an attempt to remove some of the snow. It didn't accomplish much, since most of it had already melted and matted his hair into wet clumps. Cadet watched the human's movements for a moment before fully smoothing her feathers. Cadet figured she may as well take a little break and warm up, and it appeared the human needed it too. Cadet set the leads down on the workbench before hopping down to the rocky cave floor and making her way over to her own perch by the fire. She shifted a bit on her talons, settling her wings on her back in a more comfortable position. She glanced up at Andrew, noticing how his face always seemed to take on a red flush after making a trip outside. He held his large hands out towards the growing fire. They looked stiff as he tried rubbing them together. She wondered if the cold was finally getting to him as well. Andrew raised his head, giving her a small smile as he leaned over on his elbows. "Hey, Cat." Cadet lifted her crown feathers in a single flap greeting before cocking her head. "Why do you not wear coverings on your hands when you are outside? The rest of you is covered, so I would imagine that your manipulators would need to stay warm to function properly too." "I don't like wearing the mittens when I'm chopping wood, since I want to have a good grip on the axe. I wish I did have gloves, though. I tried making my own pair, but it's much harder than it looks. All of my attempts ended up being just as clunky, so I kind of just said, fuck it, I'll deal with it." Andrew continued. "Speaking of, I do have some good news. I finished all the wood prep for the rest of the winter. We've even got enough to tide us over an extra 2 months if necessary." Cadet's expression brightened. "So you'll finally stop blasting cold air into the cave every hour?" He chuckled, reaching a hand down to the metal box near his seat. "Yep, so you can relax your feathery little butt about it. Never knew someone to be so agitated by the cold before." Cadet's crown feathers twitched. "It's not exactly a nice feeling to be focusing on work when a blast of cold air makes your feathers stand on end every half hour." The human lifted an eyebrow before shrugging. He dug around in his pocket, then pulled out a small knife and brought it to the piece of wood in his other hand. "Well, you're in luck now. I won't be doing something like that for a while." Cadet raised her feathers in curiosity as she observed the human carving away at the little piece of wood again. Upon asking what the human was working on a day ago, she received the reply, "Making some new tableware. You'll learn to pick up a hobby eventually." She still thought it was peculiar, given that he had plenty of tableware already, but she wasn't about to judge. There wasn't much to do in the cave, and Cadet was fortunate enough that she had something to work on every day. The human chipped away at the wood with precise strikes. "So, how's the repair going anyway?" he asked, his eyes flicking up from his task. Cadet's feathers immediately perked up, a definite note of excitement in her voice. "I'm very close to being done. I have one last node to repair." Andrew's movements with the knife continued, as he gave a small smile. But Cadet had learned to pick up on his more subtle expressions, and what she saw was a slight hesitance. His eyebrows furrowed ever so slightly in the firelight. Cadet's crown feathers fell back halfway, confused. "I will fix it. There's no need to worry." She tried to reassure him. His careful whittling stopped as he met her eyes, expression softening. "I know you'll get it done. It's just—" Then his uncertainty returned. "Never mind." Cadet's feathers lowered just an inch, setting his expression. That was a strange reaction. Shouldn't he be happy? With the flight recorder fixed, they would finally have the coordinates they needed to seek help. Cadet lifted her crown feathers, determined to set the human fears to rest. I assure you, the last node is more than fixable. It just requires some cleaning up and replacement wires. All I have to do is spend the time to get it done. You have stressed that I should take breaks and not overwork myself, so that is what I am doing. But I promise you it will be fully repaired in less than 3 days' time. There was a silence as the fire popped before Andrew gave a genuine smile, nodding. Of course, I have every faith you'll get it done. Catet's feathers relaxed and she nodded. Cadet did one last check of the circuit, making sure all the connections were properly soldered and wired. She tried to keep her excitement in check, but she found it impossible with the recorder fully repaired. Her eagerness to check the data almost made her do so right then, but she held back. The human deserved to see a fully functioning flight recorder more than anyone else at this point. She wanted to share the success with him. She hopped down from the table, making her way over to the human. There was only one problem with this plan, and that was the fact the human was still sleeping. A slight nervousness crept up on her at the thought of trying to wake up the Death Worlder. It was probably a bad idea, but she couldn't wait any longer. And Andrew was wasting away the entire morning, like always. She took a few steps over the slumbering figure, stopping by his head. He laid on his back on the wooden pallet with a large blanket on top, an arm slung over his chest as he breathed deeply. Cadet noticed, not for the first time, that despite his still form and relaxed expression, his eyes defied the state of sleep as they darted beneath his eyelids rapidly. Cadet still wondered what that meant. It was such an odd behavior, one she had only seen Andrew do. Of course, Deathworlders can't even sleep normally, she thought. Shaking off her musings, Cadet lowered her head ever so slightly by the human's ear. Her crown feathers lifted up and down indecisively before settling against her skull. "Andrew," she whispered. The human didn't stir. Cadet blinked. She leaned forward and whispered a bit louder. "Andrew." Still nothing. Feeling bolder and somewhat annoyed, she reached out a hesitant wing and nudged his form. "Andrew," she said at normal speaking volume. When the human finally stirred beneath the blanket, Cadet flinched and took a step back, hiding instinctively underneath her arching wings. His eyes cracked open and scanned the dim room before landing on her. He grumbled, his voice a groggy baritone. "Cat? What? It's like 5 in the morning." Andrew shifted onto his side to face her as he leaned over one arm, rubbing his eyes with the palm of his hand. Cadet peeked out from her feathered canopy before settling her wings back to her side and giving the human a look. "It's not my fault you waste so much time on sleeping. You sleep twice as much as necessary." The human blinked once, tiredly, before groaning. He pulled the blanket up to his chest again and rolled over on the pallet. "Give me another hour at least." One of the feathers on Cadet's crown twitched, impatient. "Andrew, don't you dare go to sleep. I have finished the repair." The human was still turned away, but his voice came out much more clearly. "The flight recorder's all fixed up?" Cadet squirmed in place, excited, as her crown feathers sprung upwards. "Yes, now get up. I don't think I can wait much longer." "All right, I'm up, Andrew said as he sat up and threw the blanket off to stand up. Cadet excitedly turned away and practically flew over to the workbench, perching on the back of the wooden chair as she eagerly waited for the human to shuffle over. Andrew yawned loudly, scratching at the back of his head. He blinked his eyes rapidly to clear the sleep away before making his way over to the bench and standing beside Cadet. The LED lamp connected to the salvaged battery poured light over the table's surface. He gestured with his head to the black box, smiling slightly. "Fire it up, Feathers." Cadet reached for the flash memory chip with a talon and inserted it back into the device, clicking it in place. The power supply in the box hummed to life as the tiny display screen flickered on. Cadet used a talon to tap on the screen. She became confused when she scrolled through the data. It didn't make any sense. It was complete gibberish. "Wait, this can't..." Cadet leaned forward, eyes focused intently on the screen. She tabbed through a few more files, getting the same result. It's... Cadet's crown feathers fell. "It's all random." Cadet's mind went blank as she felt an icy chill settle in her stomach. The flight recorder was compromised. How was that possible? Andrew, who had been silently watching, looked pained as he glanced over at Cadet, his shoulders stiff. "So it was scrambled, just like mine." Cadet's expression looked hollow as she stared blankly at the screen. She didn't say a word as she sat there, frozen, a look of shock in her eyes. Andrew began to worry about Cadet's continued silence. He placed a gentle hand on the back of her wings, leaning closer. I'm sorry, Kat. That's just how most of these things turn out. Something foul built up in her chest at that, and she wanted to comment bitterly on how they had all turned out this way. Her obvious point being that he was still trapped here. They both were. But she held back her voice on those thoughts. Instead, she let something else that was bothering her spill out of her mouth. Her feathers were rigid as she stared at the table, her voice hollow. Why didn't you say anything? The human looked confused, removing his hand from her feathers. What? A couple days ago, when I told you I was almost done with the repair, you looked hesitant. I thought it was because you were worried that I wouldn't be able to fix it, but... Her voice turned quiet, hushed. Did you know? Did you know this would happen? The blue in her neck suddenly flickered. The human leaned away, taken aback by her tone. He looked torn before sighing. I wasn't sure if it would work yet, so I didn't say anything. Because who knows, maybe it really could have turned out, you know? I didn't want to give you my pessimistic outlook on everything, and I would have felt like a complete douchebag if I brought all your hopes crashing down on something I wasn't sure of. He looked down, turning around to lean against the bench heavily. Guess it was a bad call on my part. Katet's sudden spike of anger melted, and she sagged on her perch, sharpened feathers softening. She couldn't be mad at him, not for this. He wanted nothing more than to leave this planet, much like her, and she was reminded of the time during that first snow. His look of such painful longing for his home would forever be etched into her memory. This human who had dealt with the hardships of survival for 6 years, alone, had certainly tried everything he knew of to escape this world. With this flight recorder, she had only gained a minuscule idea of how it must feel to have every idea, every possible lead for escape, just end in failure. She looked down. No, she couldn't fault him for his internal reservations for the project. If anything, she was only torn over the fact that he did not tell her his true feelings on the matter. Perhaps that was what made her so angry. Bringing her focus back up to the human, the blue in her frill was completely gone now. No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have reacted like that. I know you mean well, I do. But you've done nothing but try to protect me from everything this planet has thrown at me. She paused, dipping her head to try and catch the human's downcast eyes. I'm not a hatchling, Andrew. You do not need to hide these things from me. The human finally turned his head and looked at her. He really looked at her, and Katet couldn't help but shifting on her perch at his quiet stare. Before it became too uncomfortable, his eyes closed in acknowledgement, and he gave a small apologetic nod. Of course, you're right. You're not a child. I shouldn't have treated you like one. That includes telling you the prospect of bad news. Katet nodded, relieved that he understood. She turned to look at the flight recorder again, but couldn't help the drooping of her feathers. As much as she wished Andrew would have told her sooner about the likelihood of failure, she knew she probably would still be having the same feeling of defeat regardless. Andrew gave a concerned look. So if the flight recorder data is a miss, then what could it mean? Katet sighed. I don't know. To be honest, I didn't think it was possible. I was prepared to obtain at least some data from the drive, not a completely scrambled mess. Andrew suddenly looked alarmed as his eyes widened. Could someone have done this? Tamper with our flight recorders with some sort of EMP wave? Katet looked unsure for a moment, but eventually shook her head, meeting the human's eyes. Even if someone wanted to tamper with the data, it is well isolated from any external electromagnetic attacks. The only way I know of to alter the data on an emergency drive is to have physical access to it. I don't exactly know what happened on this particular ship, so it may be possible. But even then, why would someone go to the trouble of altering their emergency drive? I've never heard of that before, except for maybe... Wait a minute. Andrew squinted his eyes. What is it? Katet's eyes roved back and forth for a minute. What if it wasn't someone? The drive was randomized. And randomization means disorder, lots of it. Katet looked up, slightly alarmed. Andrew, I think this drive must have been altered by a dark energy field. The human blinked, completely thrown off by the term as he raised a confused eyebrow. And what is this dark energy exactly? Katet's eyes widened as she looked up at the human, surprised. You do not know? The human leaned back, hesitant. No, should I? Katet's eyes widened a fraction more. This Deathworlder didn't know about dark energy, the very thing that defined him? Catet wasn't sure where to start as she cocked her head and thought. Dark energy is understood to be a chaotic field. It introduces an influx of unstable energy and otherwise wouldn't be there in ordinary space. These fields of energy are typically found in dense pockets within space, so they are readily avoidable if you know how to detect them. She eyed the human, still somewhat shocked. The reason I'm surprised you didn't know about this is because that's what defines a death world, Andrew. It is why your species is given the term. What do you mean exactly? He asked, still unsure. Andrew, the true definition of a death worlder is this. A planet with advanced cellular life that resides in a field of high entropy, otherwise known as dark energy. I was not being dramatic when I referred to your world as one. The human looked stunned as he stood there, speechless for a moment, before finding his voice. You're saying that Earth resides in a chaotic field? Well, that sounds... shit. What sorts of problems does this energy cause? And what does it have to do with the flight recorder? I do not know about human technology, but those of us who are part of the Galactic Alliance use ion tech. These ion drives use quantum predictions to determine ship navigation through the hyperspace plane. The key word here is predictions, Andrew. The distribution of outcomes is different in a pocket of dark energy. It becomes highly unpredictable. The distribution of outcomes is different in a pocket of dark energy. It becomes highly unpredictable. If you can't accurately predict your way through hyperspace, then bad things happen. Very bad. The human winced. How bad? Catet squinted her eyes. From what I know, ion drive malfunction in a dark energy field can cause hyperspace rupture, meaning you get ripped from hyperspace. Violently, I might add. It results in catastrophic ion drive failure of a ship. Catet looked away suddenly, thinking, feathers dancing along her head before meeting the human's eyes quickly. Which means, that's what happened to you, isn't it? Andrew looked equally shocked, still processing the information. If what you said is true about this dark energy, then I think you're absolutely right. We were testing ion tech, and it looks like we were completely unaware of the potential danger. The human's eyes became distant. We really had no idea. Catet became concerned as the human went silent, his eyes staring at the workbench. She hesitantly inched closer to the human, asking as quietly as she could. What happened? The human turned his head away, a hollow look of pain on his face. I don't really want to talk about it, Cat. Not yet. The cave descended into silence as the human simmered in his thoughts. Catet began to worry for him. He had yet to tell her how he crashed, hadn't said much about his survival here in general. He was more than willing to teach her his survival methods, of course, but when it came to his own crash landing, the man clammed up. She wanted nothing more than to know what happened, but she knew better than to pry. Something told her pushing on the matter would certainly prevent her from ever hearing the truth. Andrew closed his eyes for a good minute before opening them again. He seemed to compose himself as he turned towards Catet, gesturing once more to the flight recorder on the table. You are confident that this black box was affected by dark energy? Catet nodded carefully. It's the best guess I have, only question is... Catet's eyes narrowed as she stared at the box. What was a Zulgaran doing flying through a field of dark energy? Could the Zulgaran have unknowingly flown through a pocket? I mean, accidents happen, of course, but it is well known to stay within charted regions of space. Most charts are programmed into a ship to avoid accidents like this, anyway. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what happened with the Zulgaran data, and it's not like we can just go ask the pilot. Catet's feathers fell an inch. I wish we had my drive. Are you sure it's not feasible to go get mine? Andrew shook his head sadly. Cat, your ship went over the mountain range. I saw it myself. Trying to make a trip out there now while there's snow on the ground would be a bad idea. We would have to wait until spring to even attempt something like that, and even then we'd need a very good reason to make the trip in the first place, as it will use up a lot of our resources. Catet nodded slowly, understanding. Andrew was right. Making the trip like that now would be ill-advised. And besides, she already had 2 other black boxes she could take a look at first. It was best to start with those. Maybe there was at least something they could obtain from them. Still, as much as she wanted to put some faith into them, she couldn't deny the bad feeling in her stomach. She knew, for her own case, that she did not fly through a dark energy field, but she had to wonder if the Zulgaran thought the same thing. It was unsettling to think about, and it left her with even more questions. Cadet glanced up at Andrew, catching his eyes as she pointed with a wing towards the other 2 flight recorders on the ground next to the bench. I should check the other drives, just to be thorough. If it turns out they were also randomized, well, then we'll probably have a much bigger problem to figure out. Hey everybody, thanks again for watching. All the things I used in the video are in the description below. If you have a story you'd like to see narrated, please let me know and I'll see if I can contact the author and we can make that happen. Thanks again, and remember to look up and seek the stars.